Hey everyone, welcome to a frequently requested puzzle solving video. Now, I've done quite a few videos already on exercises. I just had a 4-video series where I solved exercises of various difficulties. And a couple of months back, I also did a 3-part video on Puzzle Rush. But what I wanted to do for this video is just do it all in one video. I want to go from 0 to 50 in Puzzle Rush Survival. And I want to do it all at once. And there are 2 reasons behind it. First of all, I think the puzzle solving videos have turned out really well. People like them, so I want to make more of them. And, well, I guess 3 reasons. The second is that more puzzles equals better. And the third reason is that I really want to show everybody what that progression of difficulty looks like. And this will allow me to share advice on various puzzle solving levels, and as the puzzles get more difficult, I will do my best to talk about sort of what new skills are required to solve the problems as they get harder. Now, for those of you watching on YouTube, I am also streaming this on Twitch, so my Twitch viewers are getting early access to this video, and I will be referring to my chat occasionally, but I won't be doing it often. Okay, without further ado, let us begin. Oh, this is funny. This is from a previous puzzle solving session. So let me get 3 of them wrong. Let's see how we can blunder our queen in the best possible way. And let me make sure not to get it right by accident. My chat is laughing right now. Rook A2. All right, this is how a grandmaster does Puzzle Rush. Here we go. Now the slate is wiped clean, and we can begin. Now the first 10 problems are generally extremely simple. Almost all of them involve a very straightforward tactical concept that is easy to see and then easy to follow up on. So for example, here, we notice that the rooks are doubled. We see that white's king is stuck behind the pawns. This is a classic back rank checkmate, right? And what's also assisting us in these puzzles is that generally, in many cases, we're going to be down a ton of material. So you kind of know that you have to deliver checkmate. And you just start by looking at the checks. And most of the time, you're going to see the mate really quickly, even if you're pretty new to chess. So rook c1, rook takes c1 is checkmate. All right, same deal here. There's a little bit more going on. Currently, white is up a piece, but the problem is that if you just move the knight back, then the bishop on d7 is going to hang. Black is going to recapture it. And you must not forget that checkmates are very possible even with queens off the board. This is particularly a piece of advice to beginners. You should not switch off your checkmate detector just because you're in an endgame or the king is in the center. And so we should immediately start by looking at checks. All right, we have a fork on c6, but there's a pawn on b7 guarding that square. But if you look at this bishop on d2, you can slide on up to b4, and that is just checkmate. Bishop b4 is mate because the bishop is defended. The knight also guards f7. The bishop guards e8, and the king cannot step onto any of its pieces. So bishop b4 is easy. All right, so the next one is another back rank checkmate. Same pattern here. We see that the king behind the pawns, and we have an open file, so we can just take white's rook and then take all of white's pieces on the first rank. So I'm going to go through these puzzles very, very quickly. Oftentimes, you'll have the same theme repeated in 4 or 5 puzzles. Again, a back rank mate. We have a rook on the open file. Don't pay attention to this. As the puzzles get slightly more difficult, there's a little bit more fluff that's added. There's distracting factors that you have to, filter or understand which ones to filter. But here it's literally just back rank mate for like 6 puzzles in a row. Rook b1, rook takes c1, and rook takes e1. Okay, so this one's another mate in 1. There is a back rank weakness, but that's not the theme. Clearly, we should notice this battery. We have a bishop and a queen on the same diagonal. That is called a battery. And batteries generally aim at a particular pawn or a particular piece. So we just need to look at where this is aiming. Well, it's aiming on b2. Easy checkmate. All right, this is a tiny bit harder, but not by much. Yet again, we have to notice the queen and the rook. This is also a battery. This battery is trained at f7, so we should take that pawn. And now a very simple back rank mate combination. We just have to go queen f8. Technically a queen sacrifice, but a very simple one. And once again, back rank mate on f8. Okay, so hopefully not all 50 puzzles will be on the theme of back rank checkmate. Okay, so for this one, black is up 2 rooks for a bishop, but just looking at this position, you can see that the queen is hitting the rook on f8. And between these two rooks, you should obviously take the one with check, and then we can start thinking in earnest. So the only tempting thing that I see here is to come back and take the other rook. But that can be ruled out because white's king is tremendously weak. Black has all these checks. It's not worth it. That's, you know, these puzzles are not going to result in a messy solution. So instead, you should continue looking at ways that you can coordinate the bishop and the queen with a check. There's bishop g8 check, but then the king escapes to h6. But it's much better to lead with the queen in these kinds of situations. Queen g8 check forces the king to h6, and then queen h8 is just checkmate. So as long as you look over all of the checks, you're going to find the mate. There's no special formula or secret here. Just got to be methodical. Okay, so first thing I see is that white's king is really out in the open. So let's look around to see if there are any tactical ideas. I also noticed that the knight on e3 is loose. Okay, so I'm seeing that the queen and the king are lined up, and I've really drilled that in previous puzzle solving videos. This is something you always have to watch for, the x-ray, because the x-ray creates the possibility for a move like knight before check. The pawn on c3 is going to be pinned, and we're going to win white's queen. Check, knight takes d3. So two things there. The first is you look for x-rays. The second is you look for sort of a forkable situation. Anytime your opponent's king and rook, or your opponent's king and queen, are a knight's distance apart, are forkable by a knight, even if there is no knight in the vicinity, you should kind of make a mental note to yourself about that. And I'm sure we're going to have a puzzle where, you know, the knight essentially has to get to the right square and then give a fork. Here, again, it's just a fork in one move. Rook, king, knight can fork on e7. And to add insult to injury, when we take black's rook, black can't even take with a pawn because the rook on f8 is going to hang. So, boom, boom. All right, first 10 were easy. Okay, so once again, black's king kind of surrounded by white's pieces here. This is almost the same puzzle that we had a couple puzzles ago with a check on d7, forcing the king to b8, and then a back rank mate pattern here on d8. So again, very easy. All right, so apart from x-rays, you also have to always see alignment of your opponent's king and queen, or queen and rook. When they're all on the same diagonal, that's when you should start looking for pins. So immediately I see that the king and the queen are on the same diagonal. Do we have a dark squared bishop? We do. Can it pin the king to the queen? It can. Bishop c5. That square is defended. We win the queen. All right. So again, both kings here are under some fire. Black is threatening checkmate, which tells me that we basically have to play with checks. There's only one feasible check. I mean, yes, there's queen a8, but queen e8 keeps the queen in closer proximity to the king. So let's start with this check. And now this rook on g3 aiming at the g7 pawn should give you the right clue. You drop the queen back to g6 and then take on g7. As long as you practice, if you're new to chess, you know, all you need to do with these kinds of puzzles, just practice a million of them. And your pattern recognition for these easy sequences is going to come really fast. So here we have an endgame. Clearly it's not going to be a checkmating routine, but instead I'm noticing that we have two pawns here and black only has one. And black's rooks are nowhere to be found, so all we really have to do is create a passed pawn, which is going to be unstoppable. It's also important that the g2 pawn is protected by the rook. Boom, boom, boom. And black will have to give away a rook for the pawn. All right, so here black is up in exchange. And one thing that begins to be added right around puzzle 15, puzzle 20, is the notion of undefended pieces. You start getting a lot of exercises where you have to kind of spot loose pieces and then exploit their weakness. So I'm seeing this bishop on d3. In a previous video, I talked about type 1 and type 2 undefended pieces. Basically, a type 2 undefended piece is a piece that is only protected by one other piece. And the point is that it remains very loose. That bishop on d3 can be forked with queen d4 check. And then we take the bishop. Boom. Obviously not with a rook, because the queen is hanging. Takes, takes. Okay, same exact theme here. I immediately see the alignment of white's queen with the bishop on e7. So this is an overloading tactic. The queen on d8 has to protect two pieces at once. We take the rook, and we take the bishop. All right, so here we have to take black's queen to start. There's no other move. And now we have to refrain from king takes g3. As you can see, black will take the pawn. This pawn, however, is totally unstoppable. We can just push it. All right. So this is a nice mating pattern. First thing you should see here, after filtering out all of the fluff on the queen side, is the open H file. An open file like this is almost always going to be a precursor to mate. So one thing you might see here is this idea of rook h8 check, distracting, forcing the king to h8, then queen h3 check, king g8, queen h7 checkmate. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. And one thing you always have to check for, no pun intended, after you've given a check, is whether your opponent can block that check. It's just a mental note that you have to make to yourself, and do that every time. After rook h8, king takes h8, queen h3, black has bishop h4. And all of a sudden, white's attack dries up. So rather than going rook h8, we have to embark on a different sequence, which starts with bishop h7. This forces the king onto h8. This time we have a discovery. Now, where should we go with the bishop? If you aren't familiar with this pattern, it can be kind of tricky, because you might be thinking, all right, well, let's drop back to g6 or back to f5, but that doesn't make any progress. What you have to realize here is that essentially you have to do a little switcheroo. You have to find a way to clear the pathway for white's queen. The problem with keeping the bishop on this diagonal is that the queen is unable to make its way to h7. And so once you have that in mind, you should see the move bishop g8, forcing, I mean, the point of that move is just to get rid of the bishop so that the queen has access to h7. Boom, boom. All right. Well, this is just a case of a hanging piece, I think. This knight on c4 can just be captured by the bishop, so really elementary stuff there. And now you don't want to take with the queen and allow a queen trade. You want to take with the bishop when the king is checkmated, so black will have to give up a full queen. Easy enough. Okay, so seems like material is equal here. Now, not only do you have to notice open files, you have to notice semi-open files when it comes to your opponent's king. A semi-open file is a file that only contains your opponent's pawns on it, which means that it doesn't have your pawns on it. So for all intents and purposes, from your perspective, it's basically an open file. So with white's last move, the h7 pawn was captured, opening up that file. I also see that the queen is aiming at the pawn on h2. If you combine that, you should see the move rook h8, creating an unstoppable skewer. White will have to give the queen up. Okay, bishop f4 is a nice move. And the point is that if queen takes f4, you lose sight of the rook. But what you have to not be afraid of here is essentially transforming your advantage, right? You can't give checkmate anymore, so what you have to realize is that you just got to go for the extra piece. Just take the queen, white takes the queen, and knight takes e5. And that's going to be a common ending to some of these exercises. Maybe your eye was caught by the desperado, queen takes c3, but then white has sudden checkmate on c7, so be very careful in these situations. All right, 20 down, 30 to go. All right. Well, this is, I think, very straightforward again. White is down to queen, so we kind of have to play with checks. First move has to be rook takes b7. And the bishop defends the rook. And the second move, we have an open c file. Just get the rook to c1. And which piece do we take with? Well, we take with the bishop. We want to preserve the rook as the checkmating piece. Boom. And it's mate. All right, so this is kind of an Arabian mate theme. First thing I'm seeing is the presence of a rook and a knight. The rook and the knight can combine in many cases to deliver what's called an Arabian mate. And if you're not familiar with the term, just take a moment, pause the video, and Google it. But you're about to see a version of it. Now, I see two checks. We can start with the rook a8. We can start with knight f6. Don't get overwhelmed by two different move orders. Just try to logically examine each of them and see which one works. So knight f6 check allows the king to go up to g7. And at best, we can repeat with knight h5, but the king escapes the checks on g6. Now, what's the difference? Let's see. Rook a8 check, king h7. Okay, let's say we go knight f6 check now. That's the only check. And after king g6, you'll notice that the rook now has access to the g8 square, and that is checkmate. That's the difference. Check first, now knight f6, and rook g8. And that king on e5 was doing a very important job protecting the knight. All right, so once again, as I mentioned, for puzzles 20 to 30, a lot of them are going to be on the theme of undefended pieces and double attacks. Rook on a7 is unprotected. You've got an unprotected piece and a weak king in close proximity to each other. So queen c5 is pretty much a no-brainer. Take that rook. Queen takes g2, and this rook is hanging. All we have to do is move it, not to g1, but to f1, where it's protected. Okay. So this one, black is down 2 rooks and a piece. So once again, it tells you that this has to be some sort of checkmating sequence, but Can we give a check on g4? Well, no, we can't because that square is defended. So we just don't have... A lot of these puzzles, you can use process of elimination. You just don't have that many resources at your disposal. And you will not be able to mate only with a queen. So you have to go knight f4. Threatening mate on g2. And amazingly, it turns out that white does not have any effective checks. Knight g6 check is an attempt to distract the knight, which we're not going to fall for. We're going to take with the pawn. Okay, and we're going to take the queen, and we're going to win. Okay, so for this one, I'm noticing two things. The king is on e1, and there is no pawn on f2. Anytime that happens, automatically you've got to think about queen h4. In this case, it's just mate. Boom, boom, and this is basically a scholar's mate. All right, halfway there. Now the problems begin to get a little bit more tricky, but still pretty simple. All right, so this is a case of essentially two passed pawns trying to overwhelm a single rook. So the way to think about these kinds of exercises is that the rook itself is not going to be able to contain the king and the two passed pawns. So a common mistake here would be to go rook h2, right? Maybe you've heard the principle rook behind passed pawns, but that's not going to cut it because white's just going to push g5 and then push h7, and black's king is too far away. So you have to find an alternate approach to the position. And one thing you might notice is that rook takes f3 is possible. The pawn hasn't promoted yet. Rook takes f3, h7. And now very typical endgame idea. You park the rook on h3. And you basically say, I'm going to give this rook up for the pawn. So I'm going to force white to burn two more moves. And in the meantime, I'm going to start pushing my e-pawn. And in the time that it takes for white to force black to give up the rook, this pawn is going to basically already promote. So rook takes f3. Okay, g5. Now you don't want to make any moves that are not strictly necessary, right? So rook h3 would be a mistake here. There's no rush with this move. In fact, I think after rook h3, king f5, white is able to draw. So you want to play e4, and only when absolutely necessary do you want to stop the pawn. Ooh, we got Danny Wrench in the chat, subbing for 8 months. Thank you, Danny. And here rook f8 would allow king g7 with tempo. Understand the subtleties, and rooks, of course, belong behind passed pawns. This is a pure application of the rule. One last thing. I see this a lot with beginner players. The move rook takes h7 is very common because there's a tendency to get scared when your opponent is about to promote. What you have to understand is that white's newly minted queen is not going to last long. It's going to be captured by the rook, and you're wasting a move by taking that pawn preemptively. In fact, that gives white enough time to promote his own pawn. So instead, you push, and only now do you take the pawn, and you've gained a tempo. This is a winning endgame. Hopefully that made sense. All right. So I'm going to let my chat solve this one. All right, guys. Tell me the best move. And, of course, for those watching on YouTube, I'll still explain the solution. But, you know, I got to reward my Twitch peeps for sticking with me while I'm recording this video. Yeah, so everybody getting it. And for most of you guys, for most of the people in the chat, I think this is still in the realm of pattern recognition. All you really have to do here, you have a queen and a bishop, you have a wide open king. You just need to go methodically through all of the checks and see which ones work. Queen d8 check comes to mind, but then king f7 and the king escapes via g6. Well, maybe we should take the bishop. Now, why is it a bad idea to take the bishop? What is black going to do in that case? Now, obviously, I know that there is mate, but who can tell me what happens if you take the bishop? Well, black doesn't promote immediately. There's a queen on a1, but that's basically right. Black is going to move the queen away, and who knows what's going to happen. It's very hard to stop that pawn once it's on a2, and the promotion square is defended. So forget about the bishop. Let's keep looking for mate. If you look hard enough, you'll see bishop d6 check. This forces the king to e8, and now very typical checkmating pattern. Slide the queen in, queen e7, queen c7. This exists in many different types of positions. All right, so next position, we've got... Okay, so we've got a rook's doubled on the g file. First move seems pretty obvious. It's got to be rook takes g2. Now the fun begins. An important observation, white is threatening basically the same thing with queen d7. So that kind of tells me that we have to play with check. And so the move rook g1 comes to mind. Common mistake. But if you look a little bit further, you will see that white gets way too much stuff for the queen. I mentioned this in 2 videos ago. when you're winning your opponent's queen, make sure that you are actually counting the material that your opponent is getting in return. So if not rook g1, well, rook takes h2 is the only other check, and it works. We force the king to h2, and the queen slides into f2 with mate. All right. Moving right along. So here, our queen is hanging. We're up a piece with white, but our king on e1 is really, really weak. So I feel like white needs to also play very actively here. The move queen b5 is definitely possible, but it's not particularly impressive. Black also has a bunch of pawns for the piece. Black can even go queen d7. And remember that the win condition for most of these exercises is going to be more than, being a pawn up or being a point up in material. So the move bishop b5 can be considered, and I think it should be played. After c6, we have a little bit of a challenge. Now, I'll relegate this back to my chat. This pawn can be captured in two different ways. Both moves are very tempting. We can play dc and try to sack the queen, but get a discovery, or we can play bishop takes c6. I want to see how many people get the right capture. Yeah, everybody's getting it. The move is bishop takes c6. You do not want to play dc, because after black takes the queen, we push that pawn to c7, and we say, we win black's queen back. But black's queen is not going to give itself up for nothing. It's going to slide up to d7 in that position. The problem is we're going to have to capture with our bishop. The king takes, and black is winning there. Black has won back the piece that was lost, and white's position is in shambles. So we take with the bishop, and now we take with the queen, and we force black's king out into the open where we're going to finish it off. Queen d7 is less resilient because the rook hangs on a8. All right, endgame. Well, it's a rook and bishop versus rook endgame, which normally is a draw. So with best play in any given rook and bishop versus rook position, the side with the rook should be able to save the game, but the exceptions involve the king being on the side of the board because it can get checkmated. And the obvious move here is king f4. This creates essentially the unstoppable threat of rook h8. The only subtlety is here, right? We don't want to move our king again. We want to block this check with our bishop, which builds just a decisive cage for black's king. Okay, rook f3, king f3. That was easy, and 20 more. All right, so once again, undefended pieces, always something that should be in the back of your mind. This bishop on d6 is under a lot of pressure, and it's defended by the queen. And as I like to mention, the queen is the worst defender because it's so easy to attack. And when the queen is attacked, it kind of has to respond to that. And so the move knight b5 comes to mind almost immediately. Boom, bishop takes f3. Now, don't be overwhelmed by a lot of stuff going on. Just work it out calculationally. Like if you take the queen, then black takes the queen. And remember that right now, black is up a piece. So at best, material is going to be equal. But if you just take on f3 with the queen, nothing has changed. You still have the fork. That's much simpler and much stronger. And okay, we take the queen and we win. Ooh, this is a nice pattern. So the king is out of squares. And that's kind of a special situation. Whenever the king literally has no escape squares, your checkmate alarm bells should be ringing very loudly. So what you can notice here is that if the b file is open, rook b8 would have been checkmate. And so maybe queen takes a6 comes to mind, but that's not a check. Black can respond with a rook takes rook check and distract white's rook from b1. Instead, you can do that with a check. Boom. Very nice pattern there. All right, this is a very easy one. Rook on e8, type 2 undefended piece. It's only protected by the queen, and the king is also very exposed. So queen f7 should be kind of automatic here, right? Boom. Just don't take with a rook because you're going to get checkmated. We want to take with a queen here. And we stop the pawn there. This is a nice pattern. So this is a really good one. I want my chat to tell me not only the solution, but the type of mate that this is. What is this mate called? And the way that it's defined is, again, we have a situation where white's king is out of squares. And this bishop on f5 is covering two of its most important escape squares. This is called Boden's mate, named after Samuel Boden, I believe a 19th century player. It's not that he invented it. I think it's commonly, the consensus is that he was maybe the first to play this mate in a recorded game. And the point is that the knight is not necessary for the mating sequence because the bishop is already doing its job. So what we do is we play knight takes a2 check. And the key insight is that if this pawn on b2 is gone, The bishop comes out to a3 with checkmate. There's many different instantiations of Boden's mate. This is just one way to get it. And the way to do that is rook takes c3, forcing the pawn out of there, and then bishop a3 was mate. Another pattern that you should just file away into your mental Rolodex of mating sequences, and eventually you'll start noticing these kinds of things quickly. All right, so what I'm noticing here is that white's king seems very exposed. The f-file is open. And white's queen is completely out of the game. In addition, black's king is safe from checks, which tells me that the move does not have to be a check. And the move that really jumps out at me is just queen g3. That just seems to create completely devastating threats against white's king. Let's just go for it. I feel like too much calculation is unnecessary here. And now, as I mentioned previously, I think it's another case of transforming the advantage, right? You were going queen g3 because you wanted to mate your opponent, but now you have to be flexible and realize that we use the weakness of white's king in order to win a bunch of material. All we have to do is rook takes f1, and then queen takes d3, and that is totally devastating. The bishop is going to get forked on the next move. All right. So next position. All right, so we've got two monster knights. This is, sort of the first thing that I'm noticing. And I can bet you that the tactic is going to involve one, if not both of them. Who sees the solution? This is actually not that simple. The first thing that I saw was the idea of knight f takes e7, and Malcolm in my chat is offering that. Knight e7, knight e7, and then knight f6. All right, we forked the rook and the queen and the rook, but don't forget about the knight on g4, which guards that square. So that's just a trade. But after knight takes e7, we have an alignment situation. The queen and the knight are aligned, and as I said, you have to spot all open files. And so the move here that totally devastates black is a rook f7 that's going to win a piece. Boom. We just got to find one more way to put pressure on the knight, and that would be bishop h4, right? And this is a pretty straightforward move, and then black doesn't have any more defenders. And these pins against the queen are the worst. Boom. And it's over. Okay. So this seems to be one where white's king is really, really weak. Black's got a bunch of pieces surrounding it. The moment I say that, next thing I look for, semi-open files and open files. Well, there's one semi-open file, and the rook is on it. So rook takes g2 comes to mind immediately. And that also threatens mate on f2. That's got to be devastating. So like if white takes the bishop, then there's mate on f2, and this knight is pinned. So I feel like white just cannot untangle there. Boom. Okay, queen f2, queen takes e2 is just mate. Next position. Oh, this one's really cool. So clearly it's going to be one on the topic of checkmate. And the move queen a8 check comes to mind immediately. But if you calculate, you'll see that after king d7, there's no further checks. So you got to think a little bit outside the box here. Got to notice the x-ray. Black's king can step aside, and that's going to be a checkmate immediately. King h7 check. Okay, let's just be very cautious here. Don't take with the queen, because the rook x-ray defends the bishop. Instead, of course, we want to take with the rook, I believe. Take with the rook. And now, another case of transforming your attack into a material advantage. Don't look for something that's not there. Rook d7 doesn't work. Queen c5 doesn't work. We just take the rook. And that's it. All right, so king, wide open. White is down 2 rooks. Let's start looking for checks. Mental note to self, let's not allow the king back to c7. When you're hunting for the king and you feel a little bit overwhelmed, in addition to just brute force, kind of just looking at all the moves, you can also make mental notes to yourself about where you don't want to allow the king to escape. So, for example, if we take on d4, the king escapes back to c7, and that seems to be backward progress. That essentially only leaves queen d6 check. And now, those of you who are seasoned at pattern recognition, you should find the mate. Queen b4, king a6, bishop c4. But it's not too late to be sloppy. Queen c5 check. Remember from one of the very first exercises I mentioned that when you're almost mating, do not forget to check for whether your opponent can block the check. That's a very common cause of mistakes at this stage of the game. Queen b4 is better. Boom, mate. Okay. So, lots going on here. We've got a pin against the queen. We've got a pretty weak king on g1, but it doesn't seem like there's anything in particular. What else can I observe? Okay, so I see the undefended bishop on d4. That seems like a big deal. If we capture it, it's going to be check. And I see a type 2 undefended piece on b6. So this construction is catching my eye for some reason, even though the knight is attacking the rook. Who sees the solution? Yeah, so bishop a7 is the move. And hopefully you saw that as well. After knight takes rook, we take the bishop on d4. And then at the very least, we can take the knight on a8. Black is going to have 2 pieces for the rook and a completely devastating attack with this many pieces in the center. Bishop a7 creates unstoppable threats against the knight. Okay, queen d1 and just take. All right, 10 more. I think we're doing well. This is going to be obviously a slightly longer video, but hopefully not too overwhelming so far. These, of course, are the toughest 10. This is where things get more calculationally heavy and, you know, where you often have to do 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. Okay, so clearly we have these this assembly of white pieces. We've got the knight and the queen. This is leading me to believe that queen h7 basically has to be the correct move. But let's find a follow-up. Queen h7, king f8. When you're trying to get a sense of these positions, start by looking at the most obvious line. Because if that line works, you save yourself a lot of trouble. Queen h7, king f8, queen h8, king e7, and then we've got the move rook takes e6 check. Okay. Then, okay, black has to take on e6, and if you're visualizing that position, it's a situation where both queens are hanging. The black queen is hanging and the white queen is hanging. The first thing you look for in such situations is whether you can move your queen away with check and then take your opponent's queen. And you can. If you look carefully, you will see that you have queen takes pawn check, forcing the king out, and then we take black's queen. Believe it or not, black has a lot of pieces for the queen, but we also have like 6 extra pawns here, so I think that's it. Let's go. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, king d7 is another defense, but here I think the simplest is probably just to take black's queen, and after rook takes h8, just to take the bishop, and we've got 3 extra pawns, which is more than enough, even by puzzle rush standards. So boom, and it's over. Okay. So first thing I see here is the pawn on a2 being very close to promotion. This is telling me that the tactic, the solution has to be related to that, but maybe not as directly as we think. What else can I notice? I also see white's king. And I notice that if we can push it to h1, we do have a rook on f8 that can slide on over to f1. Right now I'm brainstorming. I don't know exactly how this connects yet. So really, and white is also threatening a check on a8. So let's start by looking at bishop takes bishop. Remember the rule. Checks captures threats. And that rule is a very good guideline even for these more complicated problems. After bishop takes pawn takes, if you've done a diligent job of the observations, you will notice that this gives the rook on f8 an open file, cuts off the king, and knight e2 check leads to back rank mate. So bishop takes, d takes is forced. Okay, so after bishop takes e5, d takes e5, who can tell me what black should do there? Yeah, so I think the solution is just rook takes f4, which does 2 things. It threatens knight e2 and rook f1, and the second thing that it does is, and pat yourself on the back if you saw that, the rook wants to swing to a4 and knock out the rook from a3. Okay, so this is a classic example of combining 2 sets of observations, one about white's king, the other about the pawn on a2. It's also about realizing that the rook can never leave a3, so the knight isn't actually hanging. Takes. Okay, rook takes a2 is easy, just knight takes a2 and we're up a rook. Okay. So first thing I see, black's king surrounded by the knights. I'm seeing some smothered mate action. I mean, if we can get this knight to f7, maybe not smothered mate, but it seems to be pretty devastating. So how can we go about that? Well, we can do that in a couple of different ways. We can go knight g5. We can also go knight takes d6. So I want to see what my chat thinks. Which of those do you guys prefer? Or neither? Is there a third move? Yeah, so most of my chat seems to lean toward knight g5. But I would say that the issue with that after knight g5, black plays h6, which is a common defense to this kind of thing. And after knight f7 check, the king has h7. I'm not entirely convinced by that position, to be totally honest. So let's have a look at knight takes d6. Okay, so knight takes d6 threatens knight f7. And probably after knight takes d6, black has to make some luft with h6. But I would say the difference there is that knight f7 check, at the very least, wins the bishop on d7. At the very least. If not more than that. So between these two moves, I think knight takes d6 just looks a lot more devastating. I'll put it this way. I'm not 100% sure that knight takes d6 is the move. But once you get to the 40s, sometimes you just have to trust your intuition. It just looks like all of these threats and all of these pieces have to amount to something. They have to amount to something. But I'll put it this way. I'm maybe only 80 to 90% sure that it's knight takes d6. The rook is also hanging. Yeah, that's something which I missed, believe it or not. I just didn't notice that the rook was hanging. That's a good thing to notice. Now, does that matter is the question. Well, let's think. Knight takes d6, bishop takes e1. Knight takes d6, bishop takes e1. Then we go knight f7 check, king g8. Okay. And then we need some sort of quiet move, I guess. Yeah, I wasn't even looking at a poor rook exactly. No, knight d6, bishop e1 is not entirely clear-cut, believe it or not. And maybe knight f7 check, king g8, and then just move this knight away to g5. And it's entirely possible that white's attack is devastating, but maybe it isn't. So this is not an easy exercise at all. I would say we should probably risk it. And I mentioned this in the previous puzzle solving video. I'm just as human as you are, you know, and I can get impatient too, but I think it's worth the risk. Let's go knight takes d6. It's incorrect. Wow. Maybe it was knight g5. Maybe it was knight g5. We'll have to take a look at it after we get to 50. Wow. Very, very difficult exercise. All right. We'll just have to analyze it afterward. I guess bishop takes e1. I guess bishop takes e1 was not clear cut. Okay, so this one we have to start by taking white's queen. We have to start by taking white's queen, and this seems very easy. I think we just have to push our pawns. And I mentioned this earlier. The pawns often overwhelm the rook. G3, rook c3. Okay, we just have to avoid h2 because then the rook takes the pawn with check. So we just have to go g2, and we have to find the right square for the king. Now, if we go king h6 or we go to the h file, the rook takes the pawn with check. If we go to f8, my worry is that the b pawn is going to promote with check, which really only leaves f6. All right. Okay. So again, it's going to be one of those potential mating nets. Let's see. The first move. Well, I'm noticing that there is an X-ray against the king. So knight takes f5 comes to mind. But after king h5, I'm not convinced. And black is also threatening queen f3. So do we have any other checks? So we have rook takes g6. And then after pawn takes g6, we have queen h8. That's it. The rook has to cover on h7. And then it's a type 2 undefended piece. The king is the defender. And we just go knight f7 check, forcing the king forward. And then that's mate. That's a pretty simple sequence. Okay. Queen takes h6. All right. So for this one, I'm noticing a few things. I'm seeing that there is an X-ray down the E file. I'm seeing that there's an X-ray down the E file, but I don't really see a way to exploit it. And then I'm also seeing that this queen on f6, that there is a pattern where you basically trap that queen with a move bishop g5. But it's not, you can't go that immediately because at the very least, black can take on f3. So the question immediately becomes, can we get rid of this pin first? Well, we can go g4, right? And after bishop g6, we go bishop g5, and the queen is trapped. So I think g4 is a very safe bet. Yes, very good. Next one. Okay, so this is clearly going to be one where we have to evade the checks. Now, first thing I can rule out is f takes g3. Because after queen takes g3, forget the checks. The rook on d6 is hanging, and the queen's going to capture it. The queen's going to capture it, and white's attack fizzles out. So it's going to be a king move, and the point is going to be to evade the checks as quickly as possible, because white's got a crushing attack against black's king. Where can we go to evade the checks in the most robust way possible? Okay, so king f1 comes to mind. as one possibility, and king h2 as another, and king h1. All three moves are possible. But this is going to be another toughie. Now let's think. King h2. There is another check on h3, and then we go king g2. And I don't really see any subsequent checks there. But king f1 also covers against the checks immediately. King f1. There might be queen f3, though. There might be this incredibly tricky defensive resource, queen f3. No, but then we just take on d7. Black has no subsequent checks. I think, yeah, well, king f1, my chat is asking about queen c4 check, but then all you have to do is take on c4, take on d7, and the rook's going to hang on g3. So after king f1, the rook on g3 is hanging, and a queen trade would be in white's favor. I think king f1 is the most clear-cut move, because the king is, relatively speaking, is as safe as it gets on f1. Of course, my confidence is a little bit shot after that previous problem, but nonetheless, I think it has to be king f1. But still, I mean, what's bothering me here is I can't really understand why king h2 is wrong. King h2, rook h3, king g2. Pretty tough batch today, I gotta say. Rook g3, maybe there's something crazy. But I think we should go for king f1. I just don't see a defense for black after king f1. Yep. Okay, queen takes e1 check. Now, this is a small trap. If we play king takes e1, the rook slides down to g1, and then black picks up the rook on d6. So we just got to be a little bit careful here. And we have to take with the queen in order not to allow the check. At this level, you get a ton of these subtleties. So you just got to be very vigilant. Takes. All right. And this one, I feel like will be a little bit easier because it's clear that all we have to do is extricate the knight. If we can get this knight out of a2 and escape, we're going to be a piece up. So that is our objective. Let's calculate. Well, the obvious move is knight takes c3, right? What is white going to do? White's going to go rook c1. What if we defend with a rook c5? Well, it seems that in that position, white's only serious move is king up to b4. Now I'm going to ask my chat, what does black have in that position? And something I mentioned many puzzles ago, it comes into play in that key critical position. That's knight a2 check, and then we pick up the rook. We have a rook trade, and black's up a piece. So again, knight in close proximity to the king and the rook, and you got to start looking for forks. Takes here. By the way, if white had gone king b3, then still knight a4 is good, or even knight takes c4. Okay, that was easy enough. And just a few more. All right, so it's an opening. It's an opening where the first thing that jumps out at me is that white has a lead in development. And that's sort of the first thing I see. And one pattern that I'm noticing is if we just play knight e5 here, it's a simple move, but it creates a massive threat of bishop c4, which would pile on the pressure on f7. And again, you can cheat a little bit in these positions because clearly there are no tactics. There's nothing else to do. So even though I haven't fully calculated knight e5, I know it's going to be a very powerful move. All right, Danny, see ya. Knight c6, and for some reason, they just allow bishop c4. One subtlety, bishop c4, queen a5 check. Do not forget about blocking the check with tempo. That's a very important concept. So what should white do after bishop c4, queen a5 check? How should white deal with the check? Bishop d2. We drop the bishop back to d2 with the double attack against the queen and the pawn. Easy. Okay. Well, this has to be a glitch because it's... And I mentioned this in my previous puzzle solving videos. Sometimes this happens where you essentially get a mate in 2 or a mate in 3, in puzzle 49, and then you saw the one that I got wrong. I mean, not to... I should have gotten it right, but that was incredibly hard. So this is crazy. Queen f2, queen f1 is just a back rank mate. This is literally exactly like the one we solved on puzzle number 10. Queen f2, is there any tricks? Now, when you see a situation like this, you just got to make sure that nothing is pinned, that white doesn't capture something with check. Sometimes that happens, but that's odd. All right, last one. Okay, so here we have a situation where we've got a rook for 2 pieces, and white's got a very weak king and very flimsy. Like, the first thing I see is that the bishop on b3 is a type 2 undefended piece, and the only piece protecting it is the queen. We've had this situation occur many, many times, and so consequently, the move that comes to mind, and thank you so much, Tori, for the raid. The move that comes to my mind is rook d to b8. That doubles the rooks, and it hits the bishop on b3. However, let's not stop there, because after rook b8, there is something that concerns me, and I'm going to ask my chat what it is. White has a very concerning response to rook d b8. Again and again, the bishop doesn't have to move. White can block that with knight b5. And if you've been following the principles, you'll notice that the queen and the king are aligned on the same file, but there is no pin available because both c8 and c7 are inaccessible to black's pieces. So I'm really unconvinced by that. But now we ask ourselves, do we have any other ways of attacking this bishop? Let's try to be more direct. What about rook b4? What about rook b4? This hits the queen, and if the queen moves, then we just take the bishop. White could trade on d8, but I don't see how that changes the landscape of the position. I think we win the bishop by forcing the queen out. This is a classic application of type 2 undefended pieces. Queen a6. Now, do not take the rook first, because then the bishop takes. We don't need to do that. We just take, and there's 50. And now, before we wrap up, let us take a look at that puzzle that I got wrong. Now, in order to click on it, I think I have to finish up the run here. So I'm going to get 3 wrong just on purpose, just so that I can click on that one and analyze it. So let me just try to get them wrong. Oh, that was accidentally correct. Okay, this is not going to be right. Okay, now let's see. So my solution was, and actually let me click on the analysis board just in order to be able to see the eval here. Okay, so my move was knight d6, which indeed leads to a draw. Bishop takes. Wait a minute. We might have an alternate solution situation here. Have I been redeemed? Let's see. Bishop takes e1. Have I been redeemed? Knight f7, king g8, knight e d8. This is very similar to what I suggested. Now, I agree it's much less clear-cut, apparently, than what the solution is, but I believe that plus 10 would qualify as a win. Yeah, these are unstoppable threats. Bishop takes f2. Now you just need to evade the checks. And I'm giving the computer some time to assess this, but it does seem to be winning. It's Danny Retch's fault. He was just in the chat. Yeah, bishop takes c6, rook takes c6 is totally crushing. Okay, so I have been, if you've watched all this way to the end of the video, I have been redeemed. But the move is knight g5. Why did I reject this? I rejected this because of h6. Oh, and here there's this very cool pattern, knight f7, king h7, and I missed the move knight e7. So my mistake was not to calculate deeply enough. And the point of this is that the king has no escape squares, and what's going to follow is a check on this diagonal, which is going to be totally devastating. So that was a really nice solution, but I believe that my move also does do the trick. So so that was really, really fun. Let me just go back to the Puzzle Rush board, and that was 50. That was a long video. I will definitely do a subsequent video at some point in the future where I do puzzles over 50, but I hope that you were able to see kind of what the progression looks like, and if you're newer to chess, I hope that you were able to realize that some of these problems in the 30s and 40s are very much solvable if you follow the right process and you make observations and you're tenacious. And very importantly, when you do something like this, go over your mistakes and make sure that you're kind of making mental note of patterns, whether it's a mating pattern or a double attack. Try to make sure that you're kind of trying to figure out what those patterns are and really putting it in your mental library. That's the way that you progress. All right, hope you enjoyed the video. And in the next set of videos, my positional and endgame series will continue, but hope you had fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.